where poetry speaks up. I am Tamarah Rockwood. I am coming to you from Bainbridge Island in Washington, where the salt air carries whispers and the cedars know secrets they'll never tell. If you've been riding with us before, you know the road. We coax poetry out of its shell. We invite it to dance. No hushed library voices here. No tiptoeing around meaning. Also, no creating meaning. The words say what they are. We're not going to insert anything that it's like, I don't know. Maybe that doesn't exist. Nah. It says what it says. So if this is your first time, welcome. You've discovered a place where verse gets to stretch its legs and to speak its truth. This is episode 28. 28 times we have gathered to witness literature slip off its formal jacket and find its natural rhythm. 28 explorations into this kind of poetry that doesn't just sit quietly on the page, but it stands up and it asks to be heard. Between episodes, Ben and I are busy at Bainbridge Island Press. We are coaxing stories from their hiding places. We are giving poets courage to share their work. But here on Poetics, this is our garden. This is our sanctuary. This is our revival tent for the written word. So today we are going to be exploring female poetry. It's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to be going into classical Greek. We're going to be talking about Sappho. We're going to be talking about the Dark Ages. We're going to be talking about the price of paper. So grab your favorite drink, find your comfy spot, tune those ears at a maximum reception. It is time to discover how ancient this art form is, and yet how explosively, perfectly now it can be. Welcome to Poetics. Okay, today we are going to be discussing the chapbook that we published this year, and it is titled Persephone's Testimony, and the poet is Sibyl James. This was a remarkable chapbook, and the skill involved writing it is as clear as day. I have read this quite a few times. I should probably tell you who Persephone is, because it might be a little obscure, might not, but I'll tell you anyway. Okay, so Persephone is the daughter of Zeus and Demeter. She became queen of the underworld after her abduction by her uncle Hades, the king of the underworld, who would later take her into marriage. She's also called Kor, which it means the maiden. I might be mispronouncing everything. It's not going to be my first time. So the basic story for context is Persephone was out gathering flowers in a meadow, and Hades burst from the underworld on his chariot, abducted her to be his wife and queen. Her mother, Demeter, the goddess of harvest, was devastated and searched everywhere for her daughter, and in her grief, she stopped tending the earth's fertility, causing the crops to fail and famine to spread across the world. This is the difference between spring and winter. Zeus sent Hermes to negotiate Persephone's release. Hades agreed, but he tricked her into eating pomegranate seeds, which bound her to return to the underworld each year. And the compromise was that Persephone would spend half the year with Hades in the underworld and half of the year with her mother on the earth. So what all of this represents is the myth of her abduction, is the cyclical return to the surface. It represents her functions as spring and the personification of vegetation, especially crops. And to the ancient Greeks, spring and summer signified the 6 months when Persephone returned from the underworld and her mother Demeter made the earth bloom and grow. And when Persephone left to return to the underworld, Demeter's loss was expressed in the barrenness of autumn and winter. So that is the background. I'm going to read to you I have so many windows up. Okay. This is the poem, and it's called Persephone's Testimony. There's other poems, but I liked this one, and so we're going to read it, and then we're going to analyze it, and then we're going to love it. Persephone's Testimony for Barbara by Sibyl James. I remember the first materials were ours. Silk, paper, ink, and inkstone. Woman's hands soaked with the scent of mulberries, fed to silkworms. Lamp black and glue on our fingers. The foreigner called us Ceres, people of silk. He made his word from our own. Se, silk. That was the first theft. How can I address you now with nothing but scrubbed hands? Do you remember how to begin? How to wrap cocoons in our long sleeves, carry them just beneath our hearts to give them warmth? Silkworms, spinning a language of themselves, a fine, trusted fiber of connection. Summer evenings, moths fluttering along our threads, white in the moon's white against the leaves we sat beneath, careful not to trail the long cloth in the grasses stained with mulled red fruit. We drew the silk together in rows of small gathered knots, dipped and dipped again in the hot vats of dye. The Ceres make precious figured garments, resembling in color the flowers of the field and rivaling in fineness the work of spiders. I pick the knot off my tongue, my fingers scalded on the silk brail pulled from the vat. We will know what our true work is when we can name it. The words are signs, knotting history with myth. Ceres, people of silk, Ceres, mother of grain, all our names stolen, like a daughter gathering leaves, the earth breaking underneath her of sudden caverns, rough stone, she covered all winter with glyphs, a language trapped inside a pomegranate. Do you remember the shape of talk in your throat before it colored on your tongue? The 7 brush strokes Wei Shuo taught, the first, like a line of clouds stretching 1,000 miles, not distinct, but having form. The second stroke, a rock falling from a high peak, bounding but about to crumble. The third, clean cut like a rhinoceros horn, the tusk of an elephant. Ma Shuan, always dressed in gray and black, and said, let my coffin be filled only with ink sticks. First the signs, the colors will come later. The history. Yellow Emperor's consort, opening her sleeve of cocoons, drawing the first silk thread to show the court. What did she say? Who was she? The first theft, the name. Silk, paper, ink, inkstone, and brush, the materials were ours once, and the tongue. Persephone dragged to hell with the words, Ceres, letting the land wither, letting tears scald the grass, seeds stick like bones in the birds' throats, choking song, till she got her daughter back. Got back the language, only silent and hidden. A coat of flowers. Silk talk on the loom, invisible ink, the work of spiders. What should we let wither to get the voice back? to speak past the bone of theft and find a tongue of singing in winter as well as spring. Do you remember how to wrap cocoons in warmth, how to make the strokes? The fourth, a shot from a crossbow 100 chun in length. The fifth, like an old vine 10,000 years of age. The sixth, breaking waves and rumbling thunder. Do you remember the sacred names and the sacredness of naming? I am learning my true work is to address you, and to begin I need words spun from myself, fiber pulled from hell's cocoon, to make a language of delicate and tenacious connection. I need the Ceres's patient care and the anger of Ceres, the materials and the 7 brush strokes, the last, the sinews and joints of a strong crossbow. Silk, paper, ink, inkstone, brush. Let the hush of coffins be a place behind us, a cavern left forever. Like cocoons, let us fill our split cocoons with ink sticks. I remember the brush of a tongue and the mulberry under it, first the signs, then the colors. Okay, that, I don't know, it's a very intense, very emotional poem, and I'm glad I got through it. The way that it sits on the page is beautiful, and the white space is used very skillfully. You should read it. It's very nice. So let's talk, before we get into that, let's talk about women in poetry and women's voices in poetry. Women have been writing poetry for a long time. It isn't something that just happened. It isn't something particularly new, but at the same time, it is something to address. So first I want to talk about Sappho. She was around 630, 570 BC. She stands, I think it's agreed, as the founding figure of women's poetry in Western literature. She was born on the Greek island of Lesbos. She was widely regarded in antiquity as one of the greatest lyric poets, and she was called the 10th Muse. Her work was different. Her work was intimate and personal. It was addressed to specific women and friends. It was different than the poetry that was written for the public. And she was really the first Greek poet to write expressly about feelings generated by love. So Sapphic poetry is love poetry, and it was different. She had an emotional expression that became symbolic of women's literary history. So after her, there was a time when it appeared that women's voices largely disappeared for a couple centuries. There are reasons for this besides oppression, which I'm going to let someone else take that. What I actually want to talk about is the price of paper. Paper is expensive, and it was a commodity that was not everyone could have. I have not done extensive historical research in this, and so I'm going to tell you what I think, and you can look it up and find out like how accurate it is. But like, let's take, a woman living in, let's say that she's living in a cultural center somewhere in Italy or in France, or even like, what if she lived in Ireland? And between the 1st century and the 12th century, how likely is it that anyone is going to have a paper and pen in their house? It's just not going to happen. It was something that was created and crafted for law and for deeds and for the church and for the government, and that was more likely. And so during that time, you had a lot more of the oral history. And so that's all I'm going to say on that, because I don't have a historical basis for anything deeper. But I think, in general, I think a broad stroke is fine. But around the 12th century, 13th century, all of a sudden, we had this emergence. And especially in particular, there were female troubadours in southern France. They were called You guys are going to realize why I write rather than talk. Okay, I'm going to pronounce this, and you guys are just going to have to pronounce it correctly in your own head. It's troubadours. I don't know. It's something like that. They're female troubadours from southern France. I tried to learn French during the pandemic. I took 3 years of German in high school. I'm never going to learn French. I'm just going to not go to France. That's what's going to happen. Anyways, so they were actually really interesting. They were the first recognized female composers of Western secular music. And there are still, if you wanted to look them up, they still have works attributed to them. What that tells us is that medieval women were like these troubadours. They were fun, kind. They openly criticized people and made fun of their romantic advances that they got. So that's what they did. Now, tragically, in 1209, I know you don't need this, but I'm going to tell you. I think it's fascinating. Pope Innocent III proclaimed a crusade against their region, and after that, the troubadour movement lay in ruins. But it was 1209, and I don't know. I wasn't there. I don't know how to analyze that. It happened. So maybe we could also talk about Cromwell killing the theater, among other things, but that's fine. So the Renaissance, 15th and 16th centuries, very, very interesting time for a lot of things. Besides the Renaissance taking place during that time, thanks to the Medicis, this was really a time of explosion of writing and language, and women writers were increasing. There was the first English woman to aspire to a career as a professional poet. Her name was Emilia Bassano Lanier, or Lanier. It looks Italian. I also don't know Italian. But also, we can see, it's like women have been singing, they've been writing. We are part of the language. And it's nice to see how it's utilized. Now, what's really striking is how women poets consistently found ways to transform constraints into creative opportunities. So from Sappho's intimate lyrics to contemporary poets reclaiming lost voices, women have always used poetry not just for personal expression, but as a means of cultural intervention. They are speaking truth about the female experience across the ages. So that being said, the poem is in a chapbook. The title is Persephone's Testimony. And so we understand that this is reclaiming a voice that has been taken away from the earth. And so bringing the voice back is very important. And so how do you do that? And so this testimony is just, it's such a freaking lovely poem. Overall, the chapbook is a combination. It's bringing together the Persephone myth with the history of Chinese silk production and calligraphy, both traditionally women's arts. I need to make it very clear that I have it written down here. There is Ceres, which is the goddess of grain, and it's Ceres. And then there is Ceres, which is Seres, and they're just slightly pronounced differently. And one is Greek and one is Chinese. And so it's a play between those, which is, I don't know, I like it. But in this, the poet is reflecting on how women's contributions to civilization through silk, paper, ink, the written language itself, have been stolen or credited to others. And the poem moves between historical documentation of Chinese silk-making techniques and the mythological story of Persephone's abduction, suggesting that both represent the systematic erasure of feminine knowledge and power. And then it ends with a call to reclaim these lost arts and voices. So a brief analysis of this poem, because it's operating on multiple levels. There's the personal level, the individual woman's voice. There's the mythological of Persephone's story. There's the historical, the documentation of women's contributions. And this fragmented structure that you would see on paper mirrors this broken transmission of women's knowledge across generations. And then the technical details about silk production and calligraphy brushstrokes, it grinds the mythic into the material. And it's suggesting the women's spiritual and creative power has always been rooted in the practical craft and knowledge. So two things that I thought were really interesting and surprising. So the etymological connection between Ceres, the people of silk, and Ceres, the mother of grain, the linguistic link, I think, is just a beautiful connection between the Chinese silk-making culture with the Greek mythology. I think that it was aspirational, and I liked it. It was not just showing one story. It was allowing for this story to be told in other places. And so it suggests this universal pattern of how women's agricultural and craft knowledge becomes mythologized and then appropriated. The specific technical detail about the 7 brush strokes was really interesting. The inclusion of actual calligraphy instruction is creating an almost instructional quality, as if the poem is trying to preserve the knowledge that it mourns as lost. And I thought that was really surprising, just from a craft level. Now, there was something that was a question that really, I think, followed me through this. The question was, one of the lines, what should we let wither to get the voice back? What should we let wither to get the voice back? And this challenges readers to consider what sacrifices might be necessary to reclaim things that we have lost, echoing this decision to let the earth die until her daughter was returned. And Ceres, I think, obviously, just to make it clear that Ceres and Demeter are the same person. One is Greek and one is Roman, so that's fine. But what did she decide to do to let the earth die until her daughter was returned? That's an authentic feminine expression. That is soul crushing. That's something that is a universal emotion. That just you can feel the sorrow, the longing, the dread, the terror of your daughter is gone, and she will return. So, it's just heartbreaking. The final image of filling split cocoons with ink sticks is so interesting because the cocoons, the transformation of the cocoon into a vessel for writing, it's suggesting that the death of one form of feminine creativity might birth another, a more powerful form of expression. This does not end on despair, it ends on hope. Practical, pragmatic hope. And I like that. I like hope. There is hope out everywhere. Sometimes it is helpful when someone shows you how. Now, despite this being in rather classical form and references, the relevance to it in contemporary writing, I think, is remarkable. I think that this reflects the current and ongoing conversations about whose voices get heard and whose contributions get credited. This theme of reclaiming erased history resonates with contemporary movements to recover lost artists, lost scientists, and thinkers. This poem's technique of weaving together fragmented historical sources with personal testimony mirrors much of contemporary scholarship that seeks to piece together stories from scattered places, scattered evidence. I think that is something worth doing. On my note, and it's something that I've had in my mind for, I wouldn't even say years, it's just kind of forever. And I'm going to write it down. I'm working on it, but we'll see where it goes. But what I love is folk poetry. And it isn't dramatic poetry. It isn't poetry that will get on the slowdown. It isn't poetry that will get in poetry journal. It's just, I like folk poetry. There are voices that are being written for me in Western Washington that are crucial to literary history. And I have the very, very profound honor of being able to read them and being able to publish them. Not everyone gets to write, even today. Not everyone has the time to get published. Getting published is difficult enough as it is. Not everyone. There are millions of poets in the United States. Millions. Today, you are not going to get millions of poems into the Paris Review. And they still deserve to be heard. And the reason why is because this poetry is talking about experiences, losses, grief, love, hope that they see in their backyard, that they see around them. This folk poetry is using the language of their environment around them. They are naming land in their poems that 20, 50 years from now, that land is going to look different. There's going to be development. It's going to disappear. And we know that because if we read poetry from 70 years ago, the landscape has changed and the language has changed. And what we experience has not changed. We are still loving. We are still grieving. We are still seeking hope. We are still using our language and our voices to capture our human condition and our human experience. I love folk poetry because I have read poems about tractors. I have read poems about birds. I have read poems about losing loved ones. I have read poems about children. None of this is abnormal. None of it is, it's not an outlier, but it just is very, very difficult to find this poetry. Now, you could find this poetry in your town. Some places have more poetry readings than others. Some have open mics. Some have bookstores that have open mics. Some have cafes. There are poetry groups in between friends, but it is very hard to find them if you're starting. And so I know that this is a little bit rambly, but it's very passionate for me. So I'm just saying that there are a lot of voices now that are being written today that are going to be lost. And the people that read the poems are going to be friends and family. And it's okay. But I also want to just acknowledge and celebrate these voices that do get lost in the wind because they had something to say and they had something beautiful to write down. So the relevance of this poem, the theme of reclaiming a history, I think resonates with the movements of recovering lost artists, lost writers, lost thinkers, and I don't know. It's just something to think about. Well, I think that's about all for today, poetry friends. If you've enjoyed diving into this world of verse with me, join us next time. We've got more poets to meet, more poems to explore, and more literary adventures to share. So until then, keep reading, keep writing, keep poetry close to your heart. Thank you for joining POETICS Podcast, where we bring poetry to life